Now, our next speaker is Martyn Iles, who I know you're very excited about, backed by popular demand. Martyn Iles spoke at our forum 3 years ago. He's Managing Director of the Australian Christian Lobby, which was, when I formed Family First, it was one of the first groups that I went and visited with Jim Wallace, who was the chair at the time, and still is the chair, and doing a great job. And before that, Martyn was the founding director of the Human Rights Law Alliance, an organisation that protects religious freedom through legal advocacy, a bit like the ADF. And before that, he worked in a top-tier commercial law firm. Would you welcome, please, from Australia, Martyn Iles.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's my privilege to be here, and thank you for your very kind welcome. I've been talking to a lot of you, and it's really encouraging to know that what we're doing is making a difference here in New Zealand. My task this afternoon was, as I said to Bob, to talk a little bit about answering secular culture. And at that time when I talked to Bob, I gave a title that included the word boldness. Now, since then I've reflected. I think maybe a better word would have been courage. But then, of course, as I thought about the issue of courage, I thought about something else, and I thought about the need for character. Because what we do through our courage is downstream from who we are. And we've seen a lot of high-profile people fall into disgrace lately, and I won't rehearse those things, but it's just made me realize that perhaps we need to speak fresh about this issue of character. It is our character that qualifies us for service. And there is, particularly amongst younger people, a great cry at the moment for us to go out there and to change the world. And there's a sense in which that's a very narcissistic call, right? Because you're going to change the world in some sense into your own image. And the assumption behind that is that what you are is so great that your change is going to be legendary. It's going to be better than whatever exists right now. Well, maybe not, right? We need to understand, well, what is it? What is the character? What is it that is within us that needs to qualify the change that we create? So, I will talk about character and then the courage that flows out of that. Now, I am, as those of you who know, a bit of a preacher man, and so I don't actually try and hide it anymore. So I will be talking about some lessons from the Bible. And I'm conscious that maybe not necessarily everybody in the room is a Christian, but I don't accept that what I say is not applicable to someone who's not a Christian just because it's biblical. I think that's one of the lies that we've believed. It is relevant for two reasons. The first reason is that I imagine that anybody who's a political conservative in today's world would be very sympathetic to the teachings of Jesus and to the Christian worldview. And so in that sense, I'm going to look at some of the teachings of Jesus, and I think they're going to be helpful for all of us. But of course, the second reason is that if you're not a Christian today, it is my genuine prayer that you will become a Christian. And I hope that today is an important milestone on that very important journey. It's one thing to be right politically. It's another thing altogether to be right with God. Back to the question, what are we supposed to do? Courage, character. And to the end of answering that question, I'm actually, I will, now that I've said this and I got a good reaction, I'm going to read it. Sometimes you do these things on the fly. Matthew 5, let me read it to you. Jesus here talks about what we're supposed to do in the world. And he says we're supposed to be salt. And he says that we're supposed to be light. And we'll find there's a lot of great wisdom in those two metaphors. They have layers of meaning. But he never said that until he talked about the kind of character that should lie behind our saltiness and lie behind the light that we shine. And here's the character. It says, he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, and listen to these qualities, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Very strange place to start, isn't it? Poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now listen to this. You, he's talking to a big crowd like this one, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. The character traits of the kingdom of heaven. That's what this is. Do you know one's kingdom is sort of the extent of one's rulership? That's a kingdom. It's an important thing to note that the rule of Jesus Christ begins in your heart and mine. And so it creates a certain character in that heart. It generates a certain amount of change in that heart. And Jesus says, well, what kind of change? And he rifles off this list of attributes that you really won't find anywhere else. It's a very unusual top 8 list. Is it 8? I think it is 8. Number 9 list. Thank you for correcting me. Sometimes you do these things on the fly, as I said. Poor in spirit is the first one. It's a good one to think about. Where are you poor? Answer, in your spirit. In other words, this is a recognition of the fact that each one of us, by nature, is actually desperately poor towards God in a fallen state. The realization that for each of us we are nothing less than, to quote the Apostle Paul, dead in trespasses and in sins. What does Solzhenitsyn say? The line of good and evil runs down every human heart. And we live in an age of self-esteem, and we live in an age of self-realization and self-love, and we resist the truth that the line of good and evil is not out there. It starts right here. Poor in spirit says, I have a poverty. Poor in spirit says, I recognize that in my flesh, as Paul says, dwells no good thing. And I think he meant it because we feel that way from time to time. And it's not a bad feeling to have because it reflects something of the truth. But of course, this is a good thing because what does God say in the book of Isaiah? God says, I am the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. And he says, I live in 2 places. I dwell in the high and holy place, we know that, and also with him who is of a contrite and a lowly spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I live in those 2 places. That's an important starting threshold for our character. An important starting threshold in an age of self-righteousness. Do you notice Jesus starts from the other end of the spectrum entirely? It's a completely upside down view. I was speaking recently at a academy for young lawyers and political types from across Asia. And I had been speaking to them for a couple of days before I got up and shared some words. And I noticed in the room there was a lot of people there who were interested to make a difference. They were interested to get into the political world and so forth. But I detected that in nearly every single one of them, there was a lot of self-doubt. And, that's really encouraging to me. We should have some self-doubt. Because actually, in ourselves, we don't have all that it takes. Poor in spirit. All right, let me move on. The second one that Jesus talks about is mourning. And it's a very odd one. It's the hardest to understand. All the others are clearly character traits. Poor in spirit, merciful, hungry and thirsty for righteousness, peacemaking. What does sadness, what does mourning have to do with anything in this context? In what way is that a character trait? Well, I'll tell you, Jesus was sad from time to time. And when we read in the Gospels, we find what it was that made him sad. For example, he looks out over the city of Jerusalem And what does he do? He weeps over it. It says, when he drew near to that city, he wept over it, saying, would that you, even you, had known this day the things that make for peace, but they're hidden from your eyes. He's weeping over their rebellion, over their sinfulness. He goes to the grave of Lazarus, and he's about to raise Lazarus back to life, but the shortest verse in the Bible occurs right there. Jesus wept. What's he sad about? The impact of sin and death in the world. And he was compelled, he was constrained to act in a world to save it because of the horror and the sadness and the grief of its entrapment in sin and evil. And the reason this is important is because we can't lose that as our motivating force. I talk to a lot of people in the political world, and they're angry people. And they're angry at the opposition. They're angry over what's happening. In some senses, that's okay, but it's not enough. I talk to a lot of people who are actually arrogant, and they spend their time laughing and scoffing and mocking at those who don't see things the way they see them, or who are pushing these woke agendas and this kind of stuff. I say that's not good enough, because there but for the grace of God go I. We don't see the other person as an enemy to be destroyed. We see them as a soul to be saved. And we see a world that is plagued by, trapped by, darkened by forces of evil and sin, and we are constrained, we are grieved over what we see, and we are driven to act for that world's good. And that was the kind of grief that motivated Jesus, and it should be present in all of us. We should be deeply concerned. When you hear the stories around the transgender stuff and you see the lives destroyed, you should be constrained to action and grief that drives you to act for people's good in the face of everything. That was Jesus. Meek. This is a great word. Why would somebody be meek? Well, you know, if you're poor in spirit and you realize your own deficiencies, and then you're mourning over that you find in yourself and that which you see in your world, all of a sudden, it's not all about you doing you. That's a slogan today, believe it or not, you do you. It's not all about your own, what your own self, your truth brings to the conversation, as if that's the most awesome thing in the world. Who you are. No, it's not about that at all. All of a sudden you're doing what the psalmist did when he says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my strength come? My strength comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. There is an intrinsic humbling that belongs to this kind of person. And their whole outlook is changed. They are not looking within for what they need. They know they don't have what they need. They're looking outside of themselves for what they need. And you know, the gospel brings us all low in repentance before it builds us up with the grace of God. Why? Through meekness. To get a sense of what this word really means, there's a very old English expression, to meek a horse. It means to break a horse in. And it's such a powerful word to use in that context because, to meek a horse, it means to bring a wild horse, an unruly horse, a self-directed horse, an autonomous horse, a horse that is acting in its own strength, into submission. And in bringing it into submission, to bring it under the authority of a master, this independent and assertive and self-willed wild animal becomes loyal and obedient and humble and under authority. And do you know what? That horse, for all intents and purposes, it looks like this is the very thing it was made for. To be brought under that master and to have its strength and its direction channeled according to a good end. And that's what meekness does to a person. All of a sudden, it brings us under the authority of somebody else. And God calls us to do things out of a position of meekness. Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth, it says. Why? I think the whole secret to that is caught up in his commissioning when God says, go to Pharaoh, which was a pretty bonkers thing to do. Probably wasn't going to come out of that alive in the natural realm. But and he says, I certainly can't do that. I can't even talk properly, blah, blah, blah. And then God says, but I will go with you. Right, there's the key. There's a man who moves in meekness. All of this reminds me of the story of Isaiah. And I do think that when times are getting dark and when things are looking bad, God is saying what he said to Isaiah, which is, who will go for me? Who will I send? Who's going to go out there and take a stand for all that is true and right? And Isaiah, of course, has this experience where he goes into the temple and he says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, sitting upon a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. The foundations of the temple shook and all this. And then there's angels there and they say, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And then Isaiah has this vision of God, the vision of this grand thing. And he says a few things. He says, woe is me, for I'm undone. And I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. What's he doing? First of all, poor in spirit, woe is me. He sees perfection, and unfortunately he has to look back at himself, and he realizes how far short he falls. He's poor in spirit. Then he says, I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, and I am a man of unclean lips. He's confessing sin, and he's seeing sin. He's seeing evil all around him. He's mourning. He's compelled by what he sees. And then, of course, an angel picks up a coal from the altar, goes and touches his mouth with it, says, behold, this has touched your lips, your sin is atoned for, and your guilt is taken away. And what did Jesus say? Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Because there is comfort for the mourner in Jesus Christ, in the forgiveness that he brings. And then the voice goes out and says, who will I send? Who will go for us? I think that's where we stand today. That voice is getting louder. And what Isaiah says is so important. He doesn't say, oh, I'll go. He says something a bit different, and it's very significant. He says, here I am, send me. In other words, I can't go on my own. In other words, you're going to have to, it's meekness, right? You're going to have to compel me. You're going to have to make it happen through me. Now, that is the kind of character we need today. Now, from that point of view, from that bringing down low, looking out of ourselves to something greater, we're filled with a range of things, and Jesus runs through them. The first one is that we become hungry and thirsty for righteousness. We're looking for something more, for righteousness, for goodness, and we hunger for it. It's a good test. If you're a Christian, I want to ask you, what is your appetite? What do you desire? What are you hungry for? Appetites get satisfied. They don't go unsatisfied for long. They'll compel you to do things and to act in light of them. And I do trust that we're hungry and thirsty for righteousness, that we crave what is right and true and good, and we crave what is of God. The promise is that if you have that hunger, you will be satisfied. It's a powerful promise. But then, of course, he says, blessed are the merciful. And this is another one, like meekness, one of these sort of character traits that you get from Jesus and not many other places. I've heard a lot of people described a lot of interesting ways. I've heard people described as kind, as good, as gracious. I've heard one man described as righteous once. But I've never heard someone described as merciful. I've never heard someone say, oh, Ben over there, he's a merciful man. It just doesn't come up, right? It's kind of like an otherworldly attribute. Do you know, to be merciful, it means that you don't fundamentally act towards others and towards the world at large according to what they deserve. You know, what does it say in Psalm 103? He hasn't rewarded us according to our sins. He hasn't repaid us according to our iniquities. He hasn't given us what we deserve. But as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his mercy to those who fear him. He's dealt with us altogether differently, not based on who we are, but based on the fullness of who he is. Now, we need to understand that in a world like this where we've been shown mercy, right? We need to show mercy to our world. We need to not deal with a world based on what it deserves and deal with other people based on what they deserve, but we need to deal with them according to what is God's ultimate good for them. And we need to stick to that. Always. And this helps us not go down the pathway of these sentimental understandings of certain things like love, you know. Oh, love is all about making them feel nice. No, love is about serving their ultimate good as God has defined it, at cost to yourself, not according to what they deserve. That's mercy, right? Or peacemakers, as we're going to see. Oh, that just means making people feel good and at peace and in harmony and papering over all the problems. No, peace is actually solving real issues so that people can have real peace. It guards us against those sentimental things. It's about serving the good of other people as God has defined it. And that helps us, again, as I said, you know, in politics, we don't see enemies to be destroyed so much as we see souls to be saved. I was having a conversation before about somebody who was going to stay somewhere, and the person who owned the house looked them up on Facebook and saw their Christian convictions and their conservative views and said, well, you're not welcome anymore. You know, that's the view that, oh, it's all about politics, and if you're on the wrong political side, then that's it. You're done. You're finished. You know, there's hope for everybody, right? The Christian knows that. The Christian knows actually that there's a person behind that, and they are a soul, and God would have them to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. Pure in heart. Simple. It just means that we are those who serve God alone. And we look for his interests alone. Pure just means unmixed. There's nothing else that's in the heart except a desire to do the right thing in service to God. Joseph is the example. He's away in Egypt. He's far away from his family. He's got nobody watching. A temptation comes along, and what comes out of his mouth? How can I do this great sin against my God? Oh, he's serving God, right? Nobody else. Not Potiphar, not Potiphar's wife, not anything, not his ambitions, nothing else. He's doing the right thing on the day, according to what God would have him to do. In other words, living for an audience of one. And in the political world and in all of our lives, we've got a lot of audiences looking on. There's media looking on for some of us, there's constituents looking on for some of us, there's peers, there's family, there's university friends, there's, you think of all the people we act in front of and how we can modify ourselves and change ourselves and ameliorate what we say and what we do in the service of any different audience, right? And of course, politicians have about 75 different personalities as a result, because they're trying to please so many different groups of people, and sometimes it catches up on them because they forget how to keep them all in harmony. It's such a liberating thing just to think, well, hang on, I've got an audience of one. An audience of one. And I learned that from the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, John Anderson. He said every morning he'd remind himself, today I'm playing for an audience of one. And then peacemakers. And all I want to say about peacemakers is, look, it doesn't mean cheap peace, avoiding issues, avoiding real problems. That doesn't create peace for anybody, because if it really is a problem, it's going to be an instrument of creating a lack of peace, right? And it says, peacemakers will be called sons of God. And so you ask yourself, well, okay, if a peacemaker then is bearing sort of the DNA of God himself, looks like a son of God, one of God's family, then you have to ask yourself, well, what kind of peace did God create that we're supposed to model? Well, he made peace by the blood of the cross of Jesus Christ, didn't he? He made ultimate peace, peace with himself for sinners. Now, that is ultimate peace. That is the great peace that generates all lesser peace in anyone's life. And it starts there. We can never forget our important call in the gospel as Christians. We can never forget our need to turn people towards ultimate peace, which is the kind of peace that God wills for people. But also in a lesser degree, it means we are the kind of people who seek real peace by really resolving that which is wrong. Because when you really resolve that which is wrong, that's how you create peace. God offended us all when he told us we were sinners going to hell, right? We're pretty upset by that. But hey, it was the best day of our life, wasn't it? Because it exposed the real issue and it solved it. Peace with God through Jesus Christ, yeah? That's the kind of peace we need to be thinking about when we're told, blessed are the peacemakers, for if you're a peacemaker, you'll be called a son of God. You'll be told you're just like God in the way that he makes peace. There's the character that qualifies us for service. There's the character that the world so desperately needs in people, many people, who will go out there and be courageous, and in their courage, that which flows through from their person will actually be impactful and effective and good. But here's the thing. There's another character trait. Persecuted. It's listed here as a quality of the kingdom of heaven in a person's heart. We are promised persecution. Theirs, says Jesus, the persecuted, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Wow. Not other people, theirs. I just want to make this point, and I have to make this point to young people when they come to our program called The Download for 18 to 25-year-olds. I have to just say, first and foremost, this is a feature. It is not a bug in your life. It is inescapable for the one who seeks first to stand for what is true and good and right. But it is inescapable, especially for the one who seeks to serve God. Do you know the Apostle Paul said something incredible? He said, all who seek to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. Ouch. Or Jesus said, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. Now, here's the thing. It's challenging, right? And I think that in Australia and New Zealand, we're just coming to see afresh the reality of this kind of statement. We're just coming to really see it. You know, in my work, I've been talking to a number of you already, and over again, people are saying, oh, when Israel Folau happened, right? It was the Israel Folau thing that exposed me to ACL and what you're doing. And I sit there and I look at Israel Folau and I think, yeah, he was banished, he was fired from Australian sporting codes for posting a paraphrase of 1 Corinthians 6, 9-11 on his Instagram. Now, was that persecution? Well, he lost his job and he went through a lot of dark days, and he's still banished for life from playing for an Australian football club. That sounds pretty bad to me. Or Dr. Jereth Koch, who's a practitioner in Melbourne. He's been unable to practice medicine now for 3 years because he posted online over a period of some years his conservative and his Christian political views. 3 years. Hasn't been able to practice, had to go and retrain for another career. Kathy is a lady we represented to the High Court of Australia. She has a criminal conviction against her name. And that means all sorts of things in daily life because she simply approached a woman who was approaching an abortion clinic and offered her help through a little piece of paper saying help is available. That's all she did. High Court of Australia, and the judges said, you are guilty of a criminal offence. What was she doing? She was grieved by that evil, wasn't she? And she was seeking to help. She was seeking to serve someone's greatest need at cost to herself. It takes courage to do that kind of thing. And she and her friends had actually seen 300 babies born alive as a result of their sidewalk counselling efforts outside abortion clinics in Melbourne. And you know, if she's a criminal for that, is that not persecuted for righteousness' sake? Oh, I'm sure it is. A young fellow called Joshua, one of our first clients when we started the legal stuff, suspended from university for praying with a classmate. Byron and Kira are a Christian couple from Western Australia who have had their home deemed unsafe, and they've been disqualified from taking foster children because of their Christian convictions and beliefs. And they're a solid Christian couple. Christian schools, I don't know if you've picked up on this, but they're being systematically targeted by activists if they have codes of conduct that have a Christian view on issues of gender and sexuality. City Point Christian College was vandalised. The students had to stop wearing their school uniforms on public transport, all this kind of stuff. Why? Well, first of all, for righteousness' sake, but second of all, so that they can create a campaign to remove the laws that allow Christian schools to operate by selecting staff that are Christian and by having codes of conduct that promote their values. There's also this issue, you've got conversion therapy laws, don't you? So do we. And it's amazing to me that the government can come out and perpetuate this narrative and say, oh yeah, well, we've got to stamp out this abusive coercion therapy, right? And you sit there and go, right, so that's all they need to do as some kind of dog whistle, mainly against the Christian community, to say, yeah, you know, LGBT people are being abused and mistreated by churches across the nation. That's the subtext. And of course, the people go, yeah, that needs to be stopped. That's disgusting. I'm sitting there going, what conversion therapy? What are you talking about? You know, the sorts of practices that they're invoking in people's minds simply haven't happened for decades. And when they did happen, it wasn't the purview of the church. State institutions were doing it. And of course, today they say, oh, well, there's no evidence of conversion practices actually taking place, but we need to stamp out this evil anyway. It's such a dog whistle. And of course, there's this narrative now being built up, which people have seemingly accepted, as to what must really be the attitude of churches towards LGBT people. Well, gee, I'm sorry if they get together to talk to each other about their living out their sexuality in light of their faith. And I'm sorry that there's counsellors that are part of that process and adults volunteer to have the conversations. Gee, that's coercion, that's abuse. Not. That's people who are Christians trying to be Christians. And that's the journey that we're all on. Meanwhile, I won't go through more examples, but you know the drill. I mean, more and more Christians and conservatives are called homophobes, bigots, hateful. There's legal infrastructure that is against us and so forth. And in fact, one of the big challenges we've got now is this issue of statism. This idea that Jacinda Ardern, what did she say? She said, we will be your sole source of truth. Do you know, I thought that was interesting. so interesting because she said the quiet bit out loud. And sometimes they do that. And you sit there and go, yeah, that is really where you're coming from. You really are coming from the point of view of statism. The state is the ultimate thing. And you believe in little more than your own power and your own destiny. That's what drives you. And all things must be brought to heel and submit to that great end. And what does that mean? Why does that mean that statism is a great evil that Christians need and conservatives need to be so careful with? It is because it means that truth itself must submit to the ends of the state. That's what totalitarianism is. And you see the same features of so many moments of statist control, whether it is socialism, whether it is Nazism, whether it is all these other dictators, they all use the same methodologies. It's the same evil that comes all the time, and it's knocking at our door in the West right now. And it's knocking at our door through these global institutions and all the stuff they're getting up to and the relationships they're building and the ideologies that they have. And what it means is that the truth itself will submit to the ends of the state. The truth itself must support the power of those who are in the state because that is their ultimate objective. That's what happens when you get people with no character. By the way, I mentioned meekness before. That's the difference between someone who's a Christian and someone who's not. We are submitted to a higher authority. These people in government have no authority above themselves. And that is actually one of the great problems we're dealing with today. And so what will that mean? It will mean that the truth itself will increasingly be attacked and persecuted and suppressed. And that is the society in which we live. But here's the thing. Jesus says, "Blessed are you." Wow. I detect a note of depression in the room at the moment. What's wrong with you? Jesus is saying, come on, blessed are you. It's interesting. I have had to reflect on that myself. Do I believe that? Because it's stated as a promise, a fact. Jesus says, there is actually blessing for you in this. Because actually, you don't only receive the glory of Jesus as he has it now, and we look forward to that day when the meek will inherit the earth with Christ and reign with him, but you get the cross of Jesus as well. Take up your cross, deny yourself, follow me. That's the reality that we live in today. And when you are so identified with him, there is a blessing for you. And I know that this is true because in all those scenarios I described to you a moment ago with the legal clients and the many others that we've had, I make a point now of asking them afterwards, would you do it again? And after they've been through all the trouble that they've been through, they always say to me, yes, I would. Yes, I would. Israel Folau, I asked him on stage at a conference, would you do it all again? I didn't even finish the question. He said, yes, absolutely. And I said, why? And he said, because there is a peace in your heart and there is a closeness of Jesus that comes that is priceless. Isn't that extraordinary? I hear this all the time. It's a bit like I used to read as a kid that section in Acts where Paul and Silas are in prison and they're singing hymns all night in the stocks. And I sat there and thought, they must be nuts. Nobody does that in their right mind. Well, maybe it's just true. Blessed are you. There's a blessing here. And I think some of it is supernatural. And then Jesus says, this is the joy that comes to us when we encounter Christ over comfort. Jesus says, rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And I want to say, let's not lose our big picture. I was talking to someone before and they said, what's your tip for young people going into politics, etc.? I said, never lose the big picture. Never lose your grounding, never lose your focus, because you'll be discouraged and knocked down and things will fail and it will all be so evil and messed up. If you don't keep your perspective and your focus, it will destroy you. And I come across so many people in politics who are broken down, who are miserable, who are defeated, and you can tell they never laugh and they just jibber-jabber about negativity all day long. I say, you've lost your perspective, man. You've lost it. You need to quit for one thing for a while and get it back. But we need to be grounded on that which is everlasting and that which is eternal and that which is greater than the things we see around us today. That is one of the biggest tips I can give any one of you who are looking at this space and feeling downcast by it, because Jesus is bringing all things to submit to his ultimate plan. Yeah, he wants us to help him. He says, who will go, right? But he is bringing things to submit to his ultimate plan. And every amazing story is forged through a pit of conflict and through downs, lows and highs. and through defeats and victories. And if the conflict is as hot as it is, if the lows are as low as they are, it just means it's an amazing story. And we will see one day that it truly is an amazing story, and we will rejoice that we were ever a part of it. And I go bike riding off-road quite a bit. I used to do downhill mountain biking with a friend. Now I do a little bit of I do gravel biking, for those who know it. And one of the things when you're off-road is you need to keep your eyes on the right thing. If you're suddenly worried about going off an edge and falling in a ravine or hitting a tree stump, if you look at it, you will hit it. That's just the most remarkable rule of cycling. But if you keep your eyes on where you're trying to go, you will get there. And I've got myself out of some serious jams just by looking where I want to go, and blow me down, the bike goes there. And I actually say to myself, if I'm going fast down a very rough section, I will say to myself out loud, look up, Martyn, look up. And that's what we need to do. We need to keep on looking up and not lose our focus, because great is your reward in heaven. And let me put it this way. Ever since the Tower of Babel, we have known that every civilization falls. Every single empire has its day. That is the story of history. And if you're clinging on to the false hope that the West will never end, that this empire will never fall, you're going to be dreadfully disappointed. And if your eyes are focused on here and now and this empire, and this is where your luxuries and your wealth and your riches are and where your hope is bound up, you will lose it all. And I often reflect, Babel fell. How many people lost everything that day? Quite a lot. But if we have got our treasures in the right place and our focus on the right thing, we will lose a lot less. And you know what? There's something to be gained, which is far greater and which lies ahead. And this business of bearing a cross, it's funny, Jesus bore his cross and the offense and the ridicule and the underdog status and all of this kind of stuff. And he bore it all the way to death. And now he says, well, you're going to have a cross in your life as well. The world's not going to like you. Can I just make a point? That is God's power in the world. Do when we do that, when we do experience the slings and arrows and the darts of a hostile society, just remember something. That is God's power in the world. Because it is through your going through that, just as it was through Jesus going through that, that God will work through you and do things through your testimony and through your witness and through every arrow that hits you and every stone that bounces off your back. He will use it. That is his power to reach and to save a lost world. It was in Jesus. It will be in you. And let it encourage you. Jesus says to us, I'll finish with these 2 points. Jesus says to us, well, here are 2 practical things to do. 2 practical things to do. Number 1, be salt. Number 2, be light. What is salt? Well, the message is stay salty. How do you do that? Salt that's lost its taste is salt that has been compromised by its environment. In other words, the moisture's got into it. The wetness of its environment in which it was sitting has seeped in and ruined its effectiveness. It's no longer salty. It's no longer doing its job. Salt stops the decay, right? Salt stops things going putrid. You, says Jesus, will preserve this world if you do not allow its environment to seep into you and compromise you. Do when we come under pressure, when we face those moments of hostility in our lives, every fibre of our being wants to give in just enough to make the pain go away, doesn't it? I remember when Israel Folau went through what he went through, people were saying things to him like, mate, what if you deleted the Instagram post and then uploaded another Instagram post that said something similar but in a much better way and didn't include the bit that offended everyone? Then you wouldn't be compromising, right? You'd be just doing something that would make the pain go away. And every part of us wants the pain to go away. And so we want to compromise. And Jesus says, no, draw a line in the sand. You don't have to go out chasing every conflict. You don't have to stand up on every single issue. You don't have to throw yourself in front of the crosshairs all the time. No, you don't have to do that. But he says, at least do this much. Don't compromise. Don't let yourself be changed and molded by the things that are going on around you. And there's a great lie that we believe, that the more we become like the world around us, the more we will reach the world around us. Rubbish! Jesus says your difference will make the difference in this time. And every time you do that and you don't compromise, it's an act of faith. You know, Daniel did that, right? He didn't compromise. He didn't even change the location of his prayers, which I find incredible. He reads like, penalty thrown to the lions. Okay. And off he goes and kneels down in his window and prays. I mean, remarkable saltiness in that man. But you know, what he did in those moments when he had to not compromise, he didn't go looking for trouble. Trouble came to him. And he said, well, I can't compromise. And when he didn't compromise, it was an act of faith because he was trusting the outcome, whatever it might be, to God. He wasn't actually seizing control of his future at that point. And God will plan our lives better than we will, right? You can't be sure what tomorrow will bring. And all of your most calculated games will not necessarily get you what you're looking for. Far better to do the right thing today and trust that all to God. And that is an important point I want to make about the salt. It is an act of faith. It is letting God take care of tomorrow. Now that's defensive, drawing a line in the sand. What about offensive? And that's the second and final tip that Jesus gives. He says, you are the light of the world. And you know, just as the key to being salt was don't compromise, the key to being light, as it's given here, is visibility. He says, don't let the light go under a basket. Let it be on a stand to give some light to everybody who is in the house. You know, folks, we need to be visible. We need to be visible for what we believe and what we are. We need to be visible for God's truth. And that takes practice. I think we all need to practice being visible in this way in front of our peers. And then carefully practice being visible more broadly. Because when Jesus says that when he is more visible through you, then that's better because you're like a lamp on a stand and you're giving light to others. Even better if you're a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. And can I use an example? You know, the LGBT community have actually followed this wisdom, visibility. That is how they have changed the world in the last 10 years in particular. They put their key people into entertainment, hospitality, visible industries. They wear the rainbow. They get the companies to advertise it. They advertise it themselves without shame. Visibility, it changed the world. And Jesus says that's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to find ways to be visible. And you know, it starts small. When opportunity strikes, as we know that it does, we know when we could do something to be visible for God's truth and visible for Christ, don't we? We know those moments, and sometimes we beat ourselves up because we didn't take them. You know, just practice doing one or two, and I tell you what, I promise you something. The first time, your voice will shake. And you know what? The first time, you might muck it up. And you might go home and think to yourself, wow, man, that stunk. That was rubbish. And that person who abused me, they were dead right. I got that all wrong. I got my words caught up, blah, blah, blah. I'll tell you something. You'll do it better next time, right? You learn by doing. This is one of the greatest tips I can give. You've got to start. And when you start and when you trip and when you fall, it's like learning to ride a bike. When you fall in the gravel and get gravel rash, you get up and you keep going. And you know, in a few years' time, you will not know yourself. You will be more articulate. You will know how people respond. You will start to understand where they're coming from so that you can answer them better. And they might even teach you a thing or two to improve what you have to say and what you have to do. And you might shake. Your legs might shake. Your voice might shake. Something, it's always going to be hard. But I tell you what, through experience and practice, it becomes so much easier. And Jesus concludes it this way. He says, you know, if you just fill that prescription, firstly, character. But secondly, salt, light, no compromise, visibility. He says, you know, people will see your good works and they will give glory to your Father who is in heaven. I think this is a really important connection to round out this section. It's a connection I've had to ask myself. I've asked myself, why? Why do what I do? Why get involved in the public squares in the way that we do? You know, the ultimate answer for all of us who are Christians has to be to lead people to God. and that we would be a channel for that, and we'd be a reflection of his truth and his way, and we would be a reflection of all that is good and is right. Why? As an end in itself? No. As a pointer, as a signpost, to let people see something greater. And we need to join those dots sometimes, at least occasionally, so that if someone is going to say, well, why? Why are you doing what you're doing? What is it that makes you different? They need to be able to answer that question, because that's got to be the end game of all of our lives and all of our testimony. And I tell you something, everyone will tell you it doesn't work. Everyone will tell you, if you tell you're a Christian, they'll suddenly not listen to you and it's going to be useless and don't go down that line. It's so ineffective. I tell you what, it's not true. I have been approached now by no less than 4 people who either themselves or a close friend of theirs was gay, came across the Truth of It videos, and that initiated a journey whereby they are now full-on Christians, members of churches, practicing a Christian life. No less than 4 of that particular category. Yeah, you can clap. No, not for me, for God. In that particular category, 4 people that I've become aware of. And I'm blown away by the impact it makes when people say, you know why? Here's why. And that's a challenge for us all, I think. Whatever our area of witness, it might be politics, it might be the public squares that we're bringing into submission to God and we're doing the right and we're doing true things, but we've got a whole life lived. And sometimes we think evangelism is just the guy getting up in church and saying, give your life to Jesus. That's not evangelism. It is evangelism, but that's not the only evangelism. The great evangelism that we all are charged with is to be evangelists wherever God has put us, so that we are a certain kind of person that initiates the question, why? What makes you different? And the answer is visible, like light in the world, and people might see it. And I tell you, the political world in the West is going to custard. I tell you, the more you look at it, the more you get involved, the worse it gets. And sometimes you throw your hands up and say, is there any hope? Do you know, one of the things I've learned over the last few years is that the gospel of Jesus Christ, through the witness of his people, continues. And actually, I come across so many new converts in the work that I do. And when we run our download programs with young people, a ton of them are always recent adult converts. And I think to myself, yep, God is at work in the world. Take heart, take hope. And here's the conclusion. The conclusion is, notice the turnaround. The turnaround, we started with persecution, reviling, anger, oppression, defeat, hopelessness. And then a prescription was given. Don't compromise on your character and don't compromise on what you stand for. And be light. Be the truth in the world and let people see what is the source of that truth. And what's going to happen? Complete turnaround. All of a sudden, God is at work through us and good things are happening. And I want to tell you, if we but fill that prescription, we will get the cure that Jesus prescribes. Thank you all.